everybody, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome to this Zilient webinar. This month, we're going to be talking about investing for a climate resilient world. My name is Megan Rowling. I'm the editor of Zilient.org and also a journalist with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Now, the reason that we decided to discuss investment for climate resilience this month is because we can hardly move for climate change related events this September, from the Bangkok climate talks to the Global Climate Action Summit in California last week, and then we have the upcoming Climate Week in New York City. So as businesses and investors are mingling with politicians and civil society at these gatherings, showcasing the action that they're taking, we thought it was an opportune moment to ask, how can international finance be used to build resilience to the growing impacts of global warming? And is that investment happening? The picture, for poorer groups at least, may not be as rosy as some of the glossy speeches and announcements suggest. In Bangkok, for example, we saw wealthy governments still stalling on how they will raise a promised $100 billion per year by 2020 to help vulnerable nations develop cleanly and adapt to climate change impacts. Meanwhile, much of the talk in investment circles is about moving money from fossil fuel industries into renewable energy and energy efficiency, the low carbon future the world desperately needs. But where does that leave people in urban slums, rural villages, low-lying islands and other at-risk communities who are already bearing the brunt of extreme weather and rising seas? Many of them are struggling, as we've seen in the past week or so, with storms both in the United States and the Philippines, and today on the one-year anniversary of Hurricane Maria battering Puerto Rico. Some people are being pushed deeper into poverty, or others even forced to abandon their land and their homes. So today we'll be asking who will help these people and where will the funding come from. Our panel today is going to explore some of the proposed solutions and discuss the options for new sources of climate finance to boost resilience where it's most needed. So I shall introduce our panelists now. We have Niranjali Amerasinghe, who's a senior associate in the Sustainable Finance Center at the World Resources Institute. She's an international environmental lawyer with expertise in climate change, human rights and forest governance. She leads WRI's international policy work on the Green Climate Fund and climate finance architecture. Then we have Liane, who is Associate Director of the Heinrich Boell Foundation North America, which is a political foundation affiliated with the German Green Party. Her work focuses on international climate finance and on equitable access to climate funding, especially in terms of gender. She's also an observer for civil society organizations at the board meetings of the Green Climate Fund. Then we have Olha, who works on green finance and private sector investments at the Global Environment Facility. Before that, she was with the World Bank for 8 years, and she also runs the Green Finance Professionals Network, which she founded in 2017, and we'll give you the link for that later in the webinar in the chat. We're also hoping to have with us today Sven Harmeling. Oh, I see Sven's here now. Who is the Global Policy Lead for Climate Change and Resilience with CARE International, and he's going to respond to the comments that we have from our three panelists. So before we start, just a couple of things. If you're tweeting from the webinar today, we're going to be using the hashtag #ClimateFinance, and we will be tweeting from the @Zilient Twitter handle, so please feel free to retweet or do your own tweets, and we shall retweet you. If you would like to submit questions for our guests, you can, there's two ways of doing that. For the people who are watching on the webinar via Zoom, you can pop those into the chat at the side, and I will try and pull those out and direct them to the right person. If you're watching the Facebook Live video, you can put comments or questions in there, and we will try and harvest those and bring them into this discussion. So, as we only have an hour, we shall get going, and we're going to start with Nira. Nira, from your work at WRI, you have a very broad picture of what's happening in the landscape of climate investment, climate funds. And when we talk about resilience and building resilience, what do we actually mean? How should governments and local governments and companies approach investing in climate resilience? Is it a question of investing in just climate change adaptation or investing in development? Does it matter? Is there a separation? What's your latest thinking on that?
Thank you, Megan, and hello to everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Yeah, so this question of adaptation and development and how we think about resilience or investing in adaptation, investing in resilience is a question that has come up quite a bit. It's an issue that's been debated for over a decade in our circles, and particularly in the context of the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the biggest climate funds that are out there. It was an issue that rose its head in the last year and a half, very specifically in connection with a couple of projects. And our latest thinking on this is that it's really not a question of whether something is adaptation or development. Really, the way we ought to be thinking about adaptation is that it's about doing development differently in response to climate risks and vulnerabilities. Drawing this line between adaptation and development is not particularly helpful. It's somewhat understandable why we have this debate, because we do want to be able to track climate finance as separate from, say, development finance commitments that countries have had in the past. But to apply that to a programming level isn't helpful. So what we've been saying is that when climate funds or institutions that are specialized in climate action, the way they should be thinking is really about the rationale behind any action, right? So there are going to be some situations in which it is very clear that the project, you're changing a project so that it is going to be responsive to climate change. An example would be you have a road and it is currently at sea level, and you know that this area, sea levels are going to rise by say a couple of inches. And so you're going to raise that road to respond to that sea level rise. Now that is the situation where it's very clear that you are doing this. You're going to build a road, you're going to raise it by a certain amount to respond to sea level rise. It's very clear where the line might be there. But there are lots of situations, and I would argue more situations, in which that line is not clear. And a good example is a poorer or more vulnerable community that is facing water scarcity. You could say that in general, increasing access to piped water to communities that are underserved is a development objective, and therefore has nothing to do with climate change. But if that area is also facing rising temperatures and increased drought, which means that their existing survival is threatened by climate change, then increasing their access to water, whether it's through access to piped water, is a strategy to address climate change. So really what we should be focused on is the rationale behind the intervention, and not whether this particular intervention is a development objective or is a development intervention. So that's the latest thinking on that.
I think that's really great way to start, because it suggests that actually in terms of the funds that might be available for investing in interventions that could support climate resilience, then, well, we're talking about the whole spectrum of development aid in theory. But I guess what's important there is that development actors or people who are working on development actually adopt an approach that aims to build climate resilience.
Right, well, look, there's no...
Because that's quite a high-level picture. How do you make sure that that climate resilience is built at the local level?
Right, and just to respond to that main point, there's no question that development finance ought to be bringing climate considerations into their funding, right? They need to be thinking about that too. But the reality is, as you pointed out earlier, the supply of finance is so low comparative to the cost that we definitely need more dedicated funding for climate adaptation. So just because we say development institutions ought to mainstream climate change, it doesn't mean that we don't need more money specifically that's dedicated to climate finance. So we should always keep that in mind. This local level piece is very important, because adaptation is extremely context specific, right? An intervention in one place to address water scarcity will not necessarily address climate-related water scarcity in another place. You really have to look at what the vulnerabilities are at the national and local levels, what the impacts are, and what the risks are related to those impacts. So in a commentary that a colleague of mine, Christina Chan, and I wrote recently, we focused a lot on this question of building national adaptive capacity, which is work that WRA had done in previous years as well, that you really have to focus on building adaptive capacity at national levels and national and local levels, but also that the decision making and planning around adaptation is not something that should just happen centrally. There need to be mechanisms where you're devolving both planning and decision making, as well as the management of funds at local levels, because sometimes you may have an idea of what the impacts are. You have an estimate. You think this is what's going to happen, and then things change. And climate change is unpredictable to a certain extent, right? And so communities have to be able to respond with the knowledge that they have. And if you have devolved structures of decision making and managing finance, it makes them more nimble and able to determine the outcomes that are best for them.
But putting those structures in place is not an easy or quick task. I think in the commentary you mentioned a couple of examples that are out there. Could you just elaborate on those a little bit so that people can get an idea of the kind of structures that are actually being put in place now, because things are moving forward in some countries?
Right. So one of the good examples that are out there that's actually been funded with international public funds is SANBI, the South African National Biodiversity Institute in South Africa, their small grants program. And what they did was, instead of just making the decisions centrally about what kind of funding to provide to local communities that are responding to climate change, they set up a grant facility that would be run by a local nonprofit organization. And they would work more directly with local communities and then channel money from there. And so they devolved that decision making so that it wasn't something that would get stuck up in the central system of things, but could be run by a more local institution and then managed at that level.
Right, and I think there are some similar, or aiming to do similar things in other countries. Kenya has a system of county climate change funds as well, and I personally went and saw a project that was being rolled out in Senegal in order to devolve climate finance down to very local levels and to communities there, which was being funded by the UK government and was having some interesting results because communities were deciding themselves what they wanted to spend the money on. And I think even at the top level of institutions like the Green Climate Fund, which obviously is a global institution, there are moves being made to enable national level agencies and through them perhaps more local NGOs to be able to tap into to some of these funds that are being committed at the international level. And I wanted to bring Liane in at this stage from Heinrich Boell, just to tell us a little bit more about, how do we link that global and local? You're very familiar with the work of the Green Climate Fund, and one of its aims is to build climate resilience. What is it doing, and what has it done so far in order to do that for the people who are on the front lines of climate change? Thanks, Liane.
Great. Thank you very much, Megan, for the invitation, and good morning to all. It's a pleasure to be here. Just really quickly, as Nira pointed out, I think adaptation planning is a very important piece, but also making financing available for adaptation. And I think the fact that the GCF allocation framework made a very conscious decision to spend 50% of its funding on adaptation and to basically safeguard 50% of the adaptation funding for the countries, the SIDS, the LDCs, and the African states that are experiencing already the most severe impacts of climate change is very important. So this is a contribution to shifting the global imbalance that we have on funding. And if you look basically at the portfolio of the GCF, of the currently approved and active 74 GCF projects worth 3.5 billion, with 1.4 billion under implementation. A full 37 projects, or 50% are adaptation projects. Another 18 are so-called cross-cutting projects. So the GCF expects actually that all of that will help about 217 million beneficiaries to increase their resilience. And more than 2/3 of all overall projects actually claim that they have included a focus on communities and people, the most vulnerable people, and improving their livelihood. So I think that's very important. And as has been pointed out, devolving enhanced direct access approaches, including some of the projects that we have under the pilot program on enhanced direct access with small grants facility, with this devolving decision making to actually the local level are core approaches, and we would like to see a lot more of them. But I think it's too narrow to just look again at the projects and projects implementation in the GCF, because again, Nira pointed out the importance of planning. Adaptation planning and the national processes for adaptation planning are of core importance. And there the GCF has actually really is actually really contributing significantly through its readiness and preparatory support program, which includes the possibility for up to 3 million per country for either the development of national adaptation plans or other adaptation structures. Roughly 40 million of readiness grants has already been spent for that purpose. 15 countries have actually approved NAPS planning processes, and 50 more countries are requesting it. And lastly, part of the readiness and preparatory support program is also obviously institutional building, institutional support, country coordination, and stakeholder engagement. And there particularly, obviously, we would like to see the Green Climate Fund do more. It's very interesting that a recent evaluation of the readiness and preparatory support program actually points out that there are some weaknesses in getting particularly civil society and other stakeholders engaged as much as needed in adaptation planning.
Right, and I think, you know, obviously efforts are being made and starting to perhaps to see some results, but obviously there's still a lot more work to do. One of the issues that crops up also with relation to the Green Climate Fund is that, you know, in the first round of donations to the Green Climate Fund, we saw a bit over $10 billion pledged, but then the United States stepped back when the presidency changed and Donald Trump said he would not deliver $2 billion of the $3 billion pledge made by the United States. So obviously one of the topics of conversation among the people that I've been speaking to about climate finance in recent weeks and months is this you know, a potential shortage of public money and for adaptation. As we saw at the Bangkok climate change talks, rich countries don't seem that keen to tell us where this money is going to come from. And one of the solutions that they've been touting quite frequently and indeed putting their financial weight behind is provision of insurance for extreme weather events at the country level, whether it be storms, floods. I think drought is another key area that they've been working on. And Heinrich Boell has done some interesting work released in Bangkok this month about, you know, whether this really is the answer to the lack of public funding for climate change adaptation and what we call loss and damage, which is the harm that will be done from the climate change impacts that are already coming and is very difficult to avoid. So Liane, I'm just wondering if you could fill us in a little bit on your research around that and tell us, is insurance the silver bullet that some donor countries are hoping it might be?
Yes, thank you very much, Megan. And I appreciate the opportunity to spend a couple of minutes to talk about that research that we have done. Co-author is Liane, who is a long time expert on loss and damage finance. So obviously right now with Hurricane Florence devastating the Carolinas, with Typhoon Mangkhut ravaging the Philippines, and this year also the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Maria that caused widespread damage in the Caribbean. I think the report is really, really timely. it makes the case that the almost exclusive focus that we feel developed countries are paying on insurance solution as a way to address climate disasters and associated loss and damage is actually a distraction. It's a distraction from what we think are often more suitable and cost-effective approaches, for example, social protection schemes, alternative livelihood programs or relocation funds, national contingency funds or concessional credit or contingent loans. And so we are not saying that insurance approaches don't have their validity. They definitely have to be a part of the toolkit, but they are not the silver bullet. We feel their utility is overemphasized, and new sovereign insurance schemes are pushed as a main response to climate disasters by developed countries, also as a way to distract from their own responsibility, moral and legal responsibility to pay for the damage their policies and also the historic emissions they have contributed have caused. So we looked at several case studies, and the one slide that you see is actually looking at the impact that Dominica, a Caribbean island, has suffered from Hurricane Maria, which was the deadliest Atlantic hurricane since 2004. They suffered damage of 1.37 billion or 266% of their own GDP. However, as you can see on the slide, they received only 1.5% of the cost of their loss and damage from the insurance, sovereign insurance that they had under the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. And so the majority of costs, as you can see from the slide, remains unfunded. The international community and transfers in loans and grants had to step in, and insurance, again, what was paid out by the CRIF was just 1.5%. So we feel there is no way to scale up the insurance to deal with loss and damage at a size because premiums would be prohibitive. And if we go to the next slide, and another case study that we did, a similar picture emerged from Malawi, which had sovereign level drought insurance from something called the African Risk Capacity. It was their primary source of risk financing. The drought in 2015 cost 366 million in loss and damage. The ARC challenged the claim. Ultimately, they paid out only 9 months after Malawi had declared an emergency and paid out only 8%. This again was just about, as you can see in the table, 2.2%. And when you look at the table, you also see that in all cases where you have sovereign insurance, you know, what is paid out is way below of what is needed. In the best case in Senegal, it was 28% of the needs. In some cases, like in Niger, it was less than 1%. And again, in order to bring it up to make insurance really reliable and the main answer, you would have to go to premiums that are unaffordable. So next slide. This is not a possible solution, I think, is the point that, for example, was made up by Anish Pernod from the government of Dominica, commenting on his country's post-hurricane experience and reconstruction needs. That's the first quote that you can see here. Our study argues that there should be a global solidarity fund from which affected developing countries should draw. It could be funded by some alternative climate financing sources, for example, by something called the climate damages tax, which is something that advocates have rallied around. It would impose a fossil fuel extraction levy and thus would be generating money according to the polluter pays principle on those who have contributed the most to climate change. That would bring equity and fairness instead of asking the most affected developing countries to literally buy into insurance schemes using their own public funding that they very often could more cost effectively use for other solutions. So they are doing it. Developing countries are paying insurance fee because developed countries are not stepping up to the plate, but should they really? And I want to leave you with the last quote there, which is from Simon Young, the former CEO of ARC, to contemplate that this is fundamentally an issue of climate justice.
Thank you very much, Liane. That's a really comprehensive overview of where things have got to with sovereign insurance and perhaps what some of the issues are surrounding that. So If we draw together what we've been discussing so far, public sources of finance for climate change adaptation are not enough. Insurance, while it can cover some of the losses, in some cases a very low percentage of those losses, and often we find within the climate change resilience adaptation discussion that people are very curious about the role that private sector finance can play, and what can investors do. And there's a sort of orthodoxy that, you know, that there's a lot more invested in mitigation, in renewable energy among the private sector, but the role of organizations like the Global Environment Facility, where Olga works, is to try and increase that level of private sector investment in climate resilience and climate change adaptation, as well as on the renewable energy side. So Olga, I'm just wondering if you could fill us in a little bit on how does this public sector finance work when it's used to mobilize interest and dollars from the private sector? What are some of the things that we're seeing happening now?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, happy to meet everybody and share some knowledge on that. And indeed, transition to low carbon economy requires shifting, trillions of dollars, not millions, from brown to green activities. And what we have right now, it's a big gap of around 400 billion estimate per year of financing that would have to go to conservation, including climate-friendly investments. And which is, of course, much more than any of the public sector allocations could afford. I know our budget is in a few billions per year. GCF budget is, I believe, they raised 10 billion lately. I do not know what would be per year. MDBs have from 50 to 70 in those ranges for MDB, and then what falls into environmental activity or climate activity. While institutional investors have assets under management of trillions of dollars, and the question is, can we really shift those money? And we only need few percent of that money to cover the gap. I would also say not only financing perhaps is needed from private sector, but also other important benefits and role of private sector, like bringing innovation, being first to create markets, increasing efficiency of operations. Public institutions not necessarily have that flexibility and speed. Cost saving, innovation, those are important things that private sector brings, but to just focus on the money part, I think more pressing question is what would be the barriers to bring it, and also that what we focus on, why they're not being moved so far into climate investments. And I see several barriers here, and maybe the big broad one is a policy and regulatory constraints for the private sector to do anything about it, because countries might not have financial and legal framework in place to ensure that private investors can do their operations safely. There is no land or property rights, so how come I can do my ecotourism activity, or how can I do any land restoration project, the climate adaptation project, if there is no insurance from regulation side? Or there is no carbon taxes. We talk about sectoral constraints, and of course, carbon taxes issue is very hard to get to from where we are with our fossil fuel subsidies and political cloud around it. But there is also no harmonized fisheries regulations on overfishing, illegal fishing, forestry law, for example, that would help. All the sectoral policy, public responsibilities that should be in place before private sector comes is absent in many places, and that's a barrier. And to talk in part about financial sector barriers, we have a growing green bond market, but there is no regulation on how do we actually deal with that. And green bond market, I believe right now is rising to 250 billions per year, while still less than 1% of a total bond market. And the question is, how do we help it grow? Can we define what is green? because there is a lot of contention around the green issue. Many green bonds that are being claimed as green are in terms not green at all, but there is still being issued because many countries give financial incentives for them to be issued. You can use green bonds in China to receive collateral and to receive additional debt much quicker versus if you just have conventional bond. So the question of can countries and governments help to harmonize these sustainability indicators and greenness indicators to help the financial industry to step in? Can we do something about regulation in general in the countries? And that's where public sector comes in, like Jeff and you know, MDBs, governments, local governments. There is also another barrier that is more macro, and it's more on a deal level of transactions that I see. And it's also been written about often. It's a lack of bankable projects in climate or conservation in general. How do we actually have me as a private investor receives my money back from something that is so uncertain, takes a lot of time of sunk cost to be put, and there is no guarantee that money will be back. So there is that question. There is a question of lack of management track record for the projects to receive funding, lack of scale, because if you want to encourage institutional investors to invest, they look for hundreds of millions of dollars per deal, not 2 or 3. And here is something that is encouraging because we see private sector stepping in and helping. For example, there is this wonderful coalition, it's called Coalition for Private Investors in Conservation, who are looking at this problem. How can they invest institutional money into conservation or climate projects in general? And they are trying to come up with templates for bankable projects that would then help project developers to develop projects according to the template, which would have financial incentives in mind, and bankers would be able to see those templates and to group projects together by similarities and have homogeneous packages, bigger deals, pools of projects that they could then fund according to their mandates. So that's one thing, one of the incentives that is being developed. Another incentives from on-demand side of capital for people who are asking for money. I see there is a lot of need for capacity building and knowledge sharing on behalf of project managers of environmental projects, because very often, and it's also our clients, they do not know how would they develop projects that would reach private sector investors. They do not have financial skills, and they've been working all their lives with grants. And so there has to be shift of mentality and capacity building for them to prepare these projects.
Absolutely, Olga. I think there are a lot of needs there that you're pointing to, and I think it's interesting to hear that some people are getting together, as well as the multilateral development banks and others, the World Bank too, I guess, and trying to solve some of these issues so that we can see some of the money perhaps start to flow. And I remember reading a report saying that in terms of private sector money coming into adaptation, that agriculture is a relatively promising sector, and there are signs that more money might be flowing in that direction. I'm just wary that we don't have a huge amount of time, so I wanted to bring Sven in from Care International at this point, just to respond to some of the things that we've heard. We've talked around a lot already in terms of the different options, and Care International works a lot with people in developing countries in Africa and Asia who are suffering the effects of climate change and who are in need of the money flows that we're talking about. Sven, how would you respond to the comments that we've heard today? How would you match the needs with the finance that's out there, and how would you bridge some of the gaps that our panelists have pointed to? if Sven's still there. Yep.
I think a couple of important suggestions have already been made. I mean, I think all the numbers that are available basically show, yes, while there is some and maybe even increasing activities on adaptation in developing countries, there is a big gap if we compare it to the impacts we're seeing already today, and in particular if we project it into the future. I think it's important to continue to...
Sven, is it possible to turn your audio up slightly? You're rather quiet. I don't want people to miss what you're saying.
Okay. Can you hear me now? I mean, it's the loudest I can go.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Speak loudly, please.
Good. Okay. So a couple of suggestions have been made. I think it's important to continue to push for new mechanisms which can raise additional finance, like the ones that Liane, for example, referred to. And I think in principle, this can be both for adaptation as well as dealing with the damage, of course. I think it's also important to better understand how adaptation is already incorporated in let's say development cooperation activities, and one tool to look into here is, for example, the numbers that are presented by donors either through the OECD reporting system or through the UNFC, which are basically, there's a big overlap between the two. And I think on the one hand this gives some transparency, but then it also shows that there is some let's say indication of overcoding, that many projects are counted as adaptation by donors where you can have at least make a big question mark whether this really takes into account strategically climate change and climate vulnerability. And I think there are a couple of steps that each project needs to include. If it's labeled as adaptation, it has to be based on a climate vulnerability and capacity assessment, because you need to understand what the risks are. You need to design specific steps on how to respond to those risks, how to help local communities, target audiences understand the risks and identify solutions they know ideally, but also, of course, other solutions which might help. And that's also something we are trying to include in our programs on the ground, and many others do, but I think it's very important. And there are a lot of steps you can take even within, let's say, non-climate specific programs, be it around health, be it around water, etc. Of course, it's also always dealing with uncertainty, but I think there are tools, for example, participatory scenario mapping, where you can work with communities to understand, okay, what are the different, let's say, scenarios we might face, and what are the different things we can do. And I think these also need to be increasingly integrated in proposals to big funding streams like the GCF, but also on bilateral donors.
Absolutely, Sven, those are useful recommendations. I just wanted to say that if the people watching have any questions for the panelists, please do put them in the chat at the side. And if it's for a specific person, indicate that, and I will start to feed those through very shortly. But one issue that we haven't spoken much about yet is gender. And, you know, often when it comes to agriculture, for example, a lot of the work is done by women farmers. You work a lot with women farmers, Sven, at Care International, and your latest research was specifically looking at, you know, is adaptation finance being done in a gender balanced way? Is it, and if not, how should that be remedied?
Yeah, so thank you. Basically, I'm referring to some research results we published earlier this week, which used the OECD reporting system, where you basically have a system of marking whether adaptation is a, let's say, principal part of a project or a significant or no part. And you have the same system for gender equality, and we basically cross-reference the two. We did it specifically for G7 countries on this occasion because of the G7 Environment Ministers meeting. So just to explain it a bit, I will post the link in a second. What are the results? I think what we're seeing is very, say, different level of attention to gender equality. You have some countries who have stepped up in the last years, and according to the data, for example, Canada, US, and the EU are quite okay on that. There are some other countries like Japan, Italy, France, which pay relatively low attention to it. Of course, it's also important to bring it into context of whether the adaptation finance as a whole is going up or going down, and we've seen some concerning trends after Paris that there might be a decrease of that. And there are more details in our report, but I think generally there is a sense of some sort of increased attention, but there's a long way to go to make gender equality at least a part of the key objectives of all programs, which should be reasonable. And I mean, even the Paris Agreement recognized Article 7.5 that adaptation should be gender responsive. You have a commitment to gender equality principles, and I think there's more work ahead for the G7 in that context, but probably also for other donors as well as recipient countries to pay more attention to really address gender equality, which also means understanding the relations among different genders in a specific context, identifying targeted activities to increase, in many cases, empower women better, and also advocate on a policy level. So maybe just as a short summary.
Absolutely, thanks, Sven. And as you say, you'll post some information about that research into the web chat. So we are getting a few questions coming in. Nada Barak would like to know if anybody has worked on projects related to Afghanistan. I don't know if that is the case, but if you have, please let me know, and I will try and bring you in on that. Another question is, are there any successful experiences that you know of in funding resilience in slums and poor urban communities? I think within the resilience practitioner community, which is Zilient's kind of natural constituency, we have a lot of people who work on urban resilience in cities, whether in richer countries or poorer countries. And I'm just wondering if, is urban resilience something that is top of mind for some of these big climate funds? I know that the GCF is working on a project, I think via one of the UN agencies in the Pacific. I think it was the Solomon Islands. But I'm just wondering if anyone would like to come in on that, specifically in terms of financing for urban resilience. Please unmute yourself and go ahead if you would like to.
Hi, this is Liane. If I can just come in really quickly, I think it's really a core question. The Green Climate Fund has just funded an urban resilience project in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. However, I think this is also an example of how to not focus some of the resilience financing, because unfortunately, and this is actually something that civil society has brought up in looking at the project, there was a lot more focus on the resiliency of buildings than on the resiliency of people, and ensuring, for example, that you bring in slum dwellers, local communities, local organizing within cities, and having part of the decision making about how some of that funding should be used and managed. And I think this is actually one of the bigger problems that we see in addressing urban resiliency, that a lot of it is focused on urban infrastructure and too little with a focus on the social systems that are existing within urban settings. And there again, particularly as Sven has pointed out, the need to do that with a gender responsive approach, very mindful that a lot of the poorest people are also the ones that are usually not having access to power and participation, and trying to address that proactively in such projects.
Right, very interesting. And I just wanted to bring Olga in on that, because I think you've worked on sustainable infrastructure. I mean, what's your way of thinking when the GEF goes about these kind of projects? Are you thinking whole of community, or are you thinking more about the physical built environment? How does the planning work around that?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we work with countries' governments, so we receive requests from the government based on, of course, community local needs. And then we work with implementing agencies in those countries to structure projects together with beneficiaries, with the governments, NGOs, to address those needs. And when we're talking about leveraging private sector or any co-financing in general, then we're looking into ways how can we structure our funding in a way that could be serve as a blended finance. So there would be a fund, for example, structured with grants coming from GEF or other sources, With also non-grant instrument from Jeff coming in order to de-risk further investments from private sector. And then private sector or commercial banks putting money in the same fund and sharing responsibilities accordingly and risks and returns accordingly. So Jeff would take highest risk and lowest return on its part in order to attract private sector into that funding structure, blended finance structure. And you're welcome to look for examples of these projects. I think it will be helpful for everybody to familiarize themselves. If you just Google Jeff non-grant instrument online, and there will be a couple, I think 10 examples of funding facilities with blended finance in place. Some of them related to infrastructure, some of them related to land restoration, and many of them related to climate and energy, because historically and financially it's most profitable sectors, also agriculture, as you mentioned.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, as Liane says, those type of investments have tended to look maybe perhaps less at the people side of things and more at the profit side of things. So I do wonder whether the way that those investments are approached will evolve as we get more blended finance and more development expertise coming in, perhaps married with the investor for profit approach. So I had a question from Chikondi Chabvuta, which I'm wondering was probably one for Nira, perhaps. And the question is, should governments fund their national adaptation planning processes from the national envelope? So should they be putting their own money in, whether it's Bangladesh, the Philippines, or whoever that might be? I think perhaps the answer is that they already are partially, but I'm sure you've got a much more informed take on that, Nira, so I hand over to you.
Thank you. So yes, the reality is that many countries are already putting in small chunks of their national budgets into adaptation planning processes. At the same time, there is supposed to be public funds and international funds available to support national adaptation planning efforts. So there are two funds that are they're administered by the GEF. It's the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund. And both of those funds are supposed to be able to support national adaptation planning in developing countries. And they have a program to do that kind of support. The Green Climate Fund also has committed to providing $3 million for adaptation planning processes in developing countries. So there is funding out there that is available to developing countries that they should think about strategically accessing in order to do their planning.
Right, and I think also a point that's been made to me by adaptation experts as well is that it's not just about the money, it's also about the knowledge and the expertise and building that up within the national government, so enabling better deployment of resources and also perhaps increasing the capacity of a national government to raise money either domestically or internationally. So I know for a fact that Bangladesh is quite active in that respect. There's a question here for Liane, which says, what are the prospects of the Green Climate Fund successfully going through the replenishment which is needed to meet a growing pipeline of projects? I think we would all like to know the answer to that question. It's a very topical and very hot topic. So
yes.
Take it away, Liane.
Thank you. So obviously I can give you an optimistic response, which is the one that at least civil society engaging very strongly on the Green Climate Fund hopes for. That is that we have a very successful replenishment process that would leave us with about at a minimum twice as much as we have so far. And this is in the range of then 40 billion to 20 billion, depending on whether you actually assume that the GCF currently is a 10 billion fund or more realistically a 7 billion fund, given that the US has not paid up and that we had some losses to an overly optimistic exchange rate assumption. Now, obviously, the issue of replenishment, GCF replenishment, is tied to the wider UNFCCC process. That was the big elephant in the room, or not in the room, at the Bangkok discussions. And we have a GCF board meeting coming up in basically just 3 or 4 weeks, where the issue of replenishment and kickstarting the replenishment process is going to be front and center of the discussions. And a successful outcome of that board meeting will be actually starting of formally the replenishment process. And then I think that would also send a very positive signal going into the COP24 and the discussions that we have to have there, that countries are committed. Obviously, one of the challenges will be to make up for the non-contribution of the United States, because unfortunately under a Trump administration, we will not expect or will not receive any contribution for the GCF under replenishment.
Thanks, Liane. So yes, we need to get that green light, ideally, I guess, at the next board meeting to reassure people. And then my understanding is that the process itself could take almost up to a year in terms of getting donors to sit around the table and pledge new money. So that's definitely something to watch in the coming months. We have another question, which was also something touched upon in the questions that people submitted when they signed up for the webinar, which is, what are the monitoring and evaluation procedures in place to prevent the diversion of funds, so as to ensure the funds are available to help the people that really need it? And I would add to that perhaps also, what is the monitoring and evaluation required to understand the positive benefits of investing in climate resilience? I mean, those two are not the same thing, but this idea that the money, especially grants, is handed over, and then, you know, we don't really know what the results were. I think if we're bringing in the private sector, as Olga will probably testify to, that proof of a return on the investment is potentially something that's getting more important within the adaptation sector as well. And I'm just wondering if any one of our 4 experts would like to come in on that. Please do signal or unmute yourselves and go ahead. Yeah, Sven, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think one can clearly say that it's a myth that the money would be just handed over to recipient countries or his recipient institutions. I think it's rather the opposite, that it's getting increasingly challenging to, let's say, comply with many of the donor regulations. Some of them, of course, make sense because it's important to, you know, to ensure that the money is spent according to certain rules in a, let's say, due diligence and so on. But of course, I think, and we see it even in our work as an organization who's implementing many projects, that in particular when you work with local communities, etc., it's increasingly challenging to respond to some of the complex demands. But I think we can also say that I think in most of the funds, as well as bilateral donors, there is a lot of attention to let's say, be able to report or demonstrate contributions to, let's say, key development needs. You can frame it from the SDG perspective or anything else. And the modalities then are a bit different from donor to donor, but I think there's limited value of just using a lot of money for an adaptation project which doesn't deliver any development benefits. And there are many opportunities where you can bring both of them on board. There have been studies who showed the potential of adaptation approaches to contribute to the SDGs. So I think one doesn't need to have a concern in principle. Of course, in some cases, it might be challenging to maybe achieve the results you wanted to achieve because there can be many different factors. But I think there's definitely a growing attention to reconciling or bringing together the adaptation and resilience needs with the development needs. And as I think Niranjali said earlier, it's not about adaptation or development. In my view, it's more about how much adaptation do you need within a specific development approach, depending on your circumstances.
Right. Thanks, Sven. I think probably this is a very large subject that we could take an hour to discuss it on its own, but I'm afraid we don't have that time today. And I just have one more question that I'm going to bring in at this point. And it's on a different subject from Joyce Coffey, who I know is a climate resilience expert herself. And she would like to ask the panel, how do we ensure that other development finance flows include climate risk hazards as part of their everyday work, which is what we were discussing earlier. There are better and better vulnerability data related to extreme heat, flooding scenarios, predictions that are much more kind of detailed than the typical 100-year event that many development projects use in their design. Is that information being incorporated into development decisions in your experience? Perhaps I can bring in Olga on this one. I don't know how detailed projections are that you use, for example.
Well, I can speak on behalf of several multilateral development banks. They indeed are looking into more impact indicators, as Joyce Coffey mentioned, which are measured in flood levels, etc. The same is in private sector tendency to, or other public sector approach to measure private sector investments is have to move from impact from input and output indicators that we used to deal in our metrics is what are our activities and how do I manage my activities per projects. It's more input and output metrics versus what is the outcome in flood levels or CO2 levels and what is the impact on human health. Do we have worse health? Do we have no place to live, migration, and etc.? And this is being more looked upon from World Bank perspective, Jeff perspective, multilateral banks perspective, into incorporating those different satellite imagery data, flood scenarios. It's a process still. I also can speak for impact investing. IFC is releasing principles of impact investing in this upcoming annual meetings that would also try to look into more of outcome indicators. And also many agencies are working on principles of private investors measurement, moving from ESG indicators, environmental social governance indicators that were focusing on, again, on input, what are the activities of the company, and move them towards development, some kind of sustainability indicators, maybe linking them to SDGs, linking them to impact on human health. What are those measurements? So yes, it's a process.
I think that's super interesting to hear, that if people are aligning around things like the Sustainable Development Goals, then investors and development practitioners, resilience practitioners might be starting to talk the same language. And then hopefully that will translate through into actual results of projects and investments. One would hope fairly quickly, given the 2030 deadline isn't that far away for the Sustainable Development Goals. But I'm going to have to wrap up here, but I would like to just give our panelists a short, brief word, everybody. So we shall run slightly over the 11 a.m. finish time. But I just wanted to give you all the opportunity to flag up either some kind of event or report or research or happening in the climate finance space that's of importance to your own work and has significance to the wider field of investment in climate resilience, or to finish up with the burning point that you haven't been able to make so far. So let's start with Nira, and we will let everybody have a brief word. Thanks, Nira. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Well, I'll keep it brief. This was a very interesting conversation, and I think we need to keep having it, because it sort of surprises me how often we come back to this question about adaptation and development, particularly in climate finance institutions. My hope is that the Green Climate Fund in particular is supposed to be adopting an approach to adaptation. We were privileged to be able to provide a study for them to help inform that approach. So look out for that. At some point, some of that work will become live in the next couple of months. And it kind of shows the breadth of expert thinking on this, that really we have to get past this dichotomy and be thinking strategically about how we do development differently in response to climate change.
Thank you, Nira. Let's hope that that is listened to. And we've spoken quite a lot about the Green Climate Fund, Liane, but I don't know if you have anything to add on that front.
Well, just not very surprisingly, I mean, for me, one of the core issues coming up is the next Green Climate Fund board meeting, which will be an important one, not just for resilience, but also for a set of other policies that are supposed to be discussed, many more projects that are coming forward. One I want to point out, and it dovetails with some of the research that Sven has done, that is the review of the gender policy and gender action plan in the Green Climate Fund, which is also on the agenda of the next board meeting. The GCF has one policy, but the current efforts to strengthen it are under attack. Actually, there is pushback from board members, and I think, as we heard today with Nira's comment on there not being a dividing line between development and adaptation, with the need to actually make it more people-centered and human rights-centered, the investments that you have, including through the public sector, through the private sector. I think this is actually a core policy where we are hoping that the Green Climate Fund sees it as one of the areas where they actually can be instrumental to the paradigm shift that they want to support, and show that they can improve their own best case approaches to it. So that's something that we are looking for. Obviously, we want the replenishment, but it's also important to make further improvements on some of the ongoing policy discourses, including the adaptation approach, as Nira has mentioned.
Absolutely. So they've got a lot to get through in October, I think. We shall indeed be watching. Olga, how about from the perspective of multilateral financial institutions? What's coming up that's of key importance for the
yes, there are several events, and one of them, as I mentioned, annual meetings, and there will be some key points, presentations on climate and indicators. One of them will be IFC release on principles of impact investing, one of which would be how do we measure the impact. Also, there is another conference in Berlin organized by around central bank issue and how public sector, central banks, governments can scale green finance. There was call for papers, and the best will be presented. It's November 8 and 9, and it's called Scaling Up Green Finance, the Role of Central Banks. And another one for people who live in Asia, there is a global green finance leadership program in Beijing, and they will have seminar on policy frameworks for sustainable finance in emerging economies. It's a long name, but it's basically policy part of green finance and how we move forward that important barrier or enabling environment to attract more capital and more engagement from all participants. And it will be also on November 6 and 7 in Beijing.
Okay, there's a lot coming up in the green finance space because there's a lot of work to do, I think. And so, yes, I'm sure if people want to learn more about that, they can also perhaps join your network on LinkedIn. And I'm sure you're constantly sharing all the information about what's happening there. So please do, if you've listened and found it interesting on the green finance front. Sven, what about from CARE's perspective? I mean, obviously we're all watching, or we will be at the climate change talks at the end of the year in Poland, where we're expecting to get the rules needed to implement the Paris Agreement on climate change. That should be happening in December, but how about you? What have you got your eye on?
Yeah, maybe adding to what has been said, I think there are three additional other key events and priorities. I mean, one of them is basically concluding tomorrow. That is the 8th meeting of the executive committee of the UNSC loss and damage mechanism. I'm basically here. I stepped out of the session. I posted in the chat box a link to a live update we're going to do tomorrow with a few NGOs. I don't think we will have to report any good news in terms of loss and damage finance. Developed countries managed to restrict the discussions on flows that are already out there and not really looking forward, but that's something which will likely come up at the COP again. From 10 to 12 October, there's a Climate Change and Development in Africa conference, which at least for African stakeholders, I think will be quite an important gathering to exchange experience on various, including climate finance issues. We are engaged in this with other partners, in particular PACJA, also doing some work around GCF readiness, but there will be a lot of other things, so something to watch out for. And then more or less right before the COP, the Climate Vulnerable Forum is going to host the first basically virtual climate summit, aiming to bring together various political leaders around the world and trying to make a real call for action and ambition, which of course links to the finance debate, although the focus will be on delivering more ambition for keeping with the 1.5 degrees limit. But I think that's another important one on the 22nd of November, and everyone can participate in one way or the other, as it's going to be virtual mostly.
Yes, that's good to hear, because obviously the climate negotiations are not that accessible necessarily to people outside, although there are more and more webcasts these days of press conferences and some of the plenary sessions as time goes by. So what's very, very clear from the discussion today is that there's a huge amount going on when it comes to investment and funding for climate resilience, adaptation, and indeed that there is a lot still to be worked out, a lot more money that is required. We've also had very many links and so on posted into the chat on the side, and some people are asking for the chat to be emailed to them so that they can have all that information. So we will attempt to do that. And also, I hope we haven't bombarded you with too much stuff, but we will be writing a takeaways piece, a blog that we will post up on www.zilient.org over the weekend, and you will be able to find some of the key points from this discussion, some links, and also the YouTube recording of the video, because I'm not sure that we were able to capture everything on Facebook this time. So I shall wind things up there and just say thank you so much to our panelists who shared their wisdom and insights with us today. Hopefully we can keep the conversation going as things progress. And I appreciate all the audience questions as well, and thank everybody for their time, and hope to see you again before too long. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye for now.